Thanks everybody for joining us again for our second day of our Rescuing History Conference. I hope you enjoyed the first day. A lot of really interesting presentations, and we've got more presentations today. And now we're going to kick things off with Tom O'Shea. Tom has worked at the Trustees of Reservations since 2013, first as the Director of Field Operations and now as the Director of Stewardship and Natural Resources. In collaboration with partners, specialists, and property managers, Tom has led a number of new stewardship initiatives to drive and support achievement of sustainability, resource integrity, and stewardship excellence across the organization. These include the development of innovative stewardship systems, standards and assessments, property and capital planning approaches, and data-driven performance metrics. Tom has over 20 years of experience in natural resources, forestry, and wildlife conservation in Massachusetts, and holds an MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and a Master's of Forestry from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a BS in Forestry from the University of Maine. Tom, we're so glad that you're here with us this morning, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you, Mary, and I'm really honored to be here and appreciate the opportunity to present as part of the Nantucket Preservation Trust Symposium. And just to also add that in addition to being a forester, I have over time moved into coastal resiliency and climate much more so, particularly because, as the trustees have found, we've had tremendous impacts already to our properties. And in fact, we started off the coastal vulnerability assessment, which will give you a little bit of sense of that, about 3 or 4 years ago. And also, we have really launched a coastal strategy over the last 2.5 years as part of our strategic plan. So what you'll see is in context of all that. If you give me a chance, I will share my screen and really get into the presentation. And Mary, just to check, can you just let me know everyone can see this on my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. So today what I'd like to do is talk about, as you see here, the vulnerability of Coskata-Coatue Wildlife Refuge on Nantucket. And it's really symptomatic of what we're seeing along beaches in Massachusetts and even the East Coast. But I would say Nantucket is on the front lines, as many of you already know, of climate impacts from sea level rise and storm surge. So we're going to take a look at what we've found out and what we're thinking about for the future. And just to put it in perspective, we have Coskata-Coatue down here as one of our 35 plus coastal properties in the state. And just so you know, we are the largest nonprofit steward of coastline in Massachusetts. We own it or protect 120 miles. And as part of that, Nantucket is one of our top featured properties in terms of our coastal properties, absolutely spectacular and unique in so many ways, which I'll just discuss briefly. But also, it really ranked as one of our top 5 most at-risk properties. So what I'm going to go through today is a little bit about climate change impacts, and then talk a little bit about coastal processes and shoreline change on Coskata, give a historical context, and then get into the future vulnerabilities, and then kind of discuss some strategies and interventions we're thinking about, and get your feedback with some questions and answers. I first want to thank everybody that has really been working with us, and we're working with as well, to really think about how we, tackle the issues of climate change and think about coastal resiliency, not only in our properties, but throughout Nantucket. We've been working with our partner, Nantucket Conservation Foundation, who owns land jointly with us throughout the refuge. We've also been having conversations with the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee through Vince Murphy, been working with Boston University across our properties in terms of coastal research, but thinking about Nantucket. We've been working with Woods Hole Group for some time on a number of different projects of coastal resiliency. We've been presenting to Nantucket through the Coastal Conference, Keeping History Above Water, and are also honored, as I've said, to partner with Nantucket Preservation Trust. We are also an organization whose mission involves cultural resources as well as natural resources. And we hope to continue these partnerships into the future. So Coskata-Coatue is an incredible place. I mean, I've been to beaches and coastal areas throughout Massachusetts. I have to say that this is one of the most unique and spectacular places in such a unique experience. Nantucket is in general, which I don't have to mention to all of you. But some pictures here just showing the kind of public access of over 5 miles of shoreline. People can get through, they're overseeing vehicles or walking, but because it's so long, those overseeing vehicles are really the most practical way to get out there. And, you know, beach going, I mean, here's a picture of my family and I just enjoying some time out there on the beach. That very, I mean, where do you get that kind of experience in the state? And of course, people love to go out there for fishing and many other different forms of recreation. And the lighthouse at Great Point is an incredible historic feature. And of course, can provide some incredible views. And I know there's a lot of interest in rehabilitation of the lighthouse, but it's an incredible historic feature as well. But what we're seeing now is that more and more we're having to shut down access because of these sort of surges and overwash. This was just taken this week, and this is just an increasing issue where normally you could drive all the way out there, but now we have to close it. It just isn't safe to drive or even possible. And so public access is a real question for the future. It has some incredible habitat and biodiversity, and as many of you know, it's geologically unique. It is called a cuspate spit formation around Coatue. There's only a few in the whole world. We have a prickly pear cactus out there, which is a state-listed species, and I think is the only population found in Massachusetts. Oyster catchers, shorebirds, lots of winter migration that's happening around Coskata-Coatue Wildlife Refuge. Of course, you'll see seals out there in large colonies. It's an incredible place and very unique environment for habitat and diversity. But you also can tell that just in this picture alone that it has some very narrow spots, and the narrowing will continue given sea level rise, and there's a coastal process that happens that creates that narrowing and ultimately breaches, which have happened historically but could be more frequent. And so the question for us is going to be those values that you just saw above, how will we maintain those into the future in a sustainable way? We just recently released a State of the Coast report for the North Shore. And in that report, we really focused on 2 climate impacts in particular. One is sea level rise, and the other is storm surge, stronger storms. And the reason we focused on those 2 is those are the ones that are accelerating the most. And from the modeling that we looked at after 2050, I mean, it really takes off. And so we have some time now in some ways, even though there'll still be increases in both sea level rise and storm surge, there's some time now to really, I think, try out different adaptations, make smart choices and plan for the future, but we don't have a lot of time. And so that was really a focus of this report is, okay, well then what can we do? What are we doing today? And so I think it's really timely that we have this symposium today to talk about these issues. In terms of the future vulnerability of Nantucket, looking at both what Woods Hole Group has modeled and then what Boston University has been looking at, these are some of the things that we can think about. And so not only sea level rise, as I showed you in the previous graph, but just larger and more frequent storms. And Nantucket's right there in the track. Just to go back, you'll see that the 1 in 10-year storm in 2050 will be almost as much, if not more, in terms of flood surge than the historic trends for a 1 in 100-year storm. So 30 years from now, a 1 in 10-year storm is basically like today's 1 in 100-year storm, just to give you a sense. So we should really talk about what that means to properties and beaches and places along Nantucket. In the State of the Coast report, we really dove into beaches and really saw that shoreline loss from erosion is the primary issue. And one could argue, well, there's nothing you can do about it. And so that's the question we tried to explore. What can be done and for how long, and what are the benefits, and what does it mean depending on what your values are? And so I would ask you to maybe look at that report and explore some of the things that we talked about. You go and look at 2 different types of beaches here. This is up on the North Shore of Massachusetts. You've got Rockport, a much smaller beach, hemmed in by a seawall and development. That beach has nowhere to go. And so as it erodes, the town's finding that it has to supplement with sand in order to maintain that beach and that barrier protection for storms, the development as well as recreational space. So even a 1 or 2 foot loss of shoreline is huge for those types of beaches. You look at Crane Beach, which we manage up in Ipswich, it has seen over 84 football fields of shoreline loss since 1952 in red. But some would say, well, that's a large beach, and so it can, so, you know, what's the big deal? So if you lose it, but it's so big, you know, it's more resilient. And while that's true, it's still an important area and protection for Essex that is behind that, their harbor and area behind that. So we're working with the town of Essex right now in a coastal resiliency modeling study and coastal wave sediment study to understand the future of Crane Beach as it is a form of protection for the town. And then we looked at, with Woods Hole Group, all of our properties, sort of, you know, the consequence and the inundation probabilities of flooding. And Nantucket was way up there pretty high. So those dark colors up in here pretty much show very high probabilities in 2030 and 2070 of being inundated. It's not a surprise for us. And then just some of the hot spots of impact based on some of the resources that are there. And so the hot spots you can see in some of those narrow barrier beach areas. And this is sea level rise impacts to the habitats over time. One of the things just to see is that some of these marsh areas pretty much go away and turn into beach and tidal flats. And so what is upland now in gray starts to convert into wetland types and beach types. And as I mentioned, Coskata-Coatue is one of our top 5 properties at risk from our coastal vulnerability assessment across all of our properties. And then if you look at it in terms of erosion rates, this is from the Coastal Erosion Commission report from Massachusetts, from Coastal Zone Management Agency, and they just had measurements of erosion rates from various beaches across the state, and this is looking at the Cape and the islands, and you can just see that Nantucket has some of the higher rates of shoreline erosion. Now, they didn't measure Coskata-Coatue, but they did have McConnell's Surfside in there in the measurements. So let's relate it to just the geology of Nantucket, which many of you already know, but I think what's interesting to show is that Coskata-Coatue area is mostly beach and dune deposits. It's in fact one of the largest areas of sand supply in the entire Nantucket Island. And then you've got Sconset and the areas that I just mentioned below here, and some of the others up on the north side of the island. But you can see that it's really shifting sand that really supplies much of the sand in the area and much of the beach in the area. And so if we just look at it from kind of a, you know, bird's eye view up here, what we see is that the narrowest part, right, called the galls, these basically have breached in the past historically. And so we're wondering, well, what will happen with sea level rise and storm surge? How often would they breach, and what can we do to sort of think about creating a more resilient barrier beach system? What would be the implications on the harbor as well? So maybe just kind of think about that, and we'll get to that later. But I'm going to show you now some changes in shorelines over time to put some things in perspective. And you can just see it. These red dotted lines are from the 1800s, and then these darker lines are more recent. So you can see a definite retreat landward of the shoreline. So we look up here in Coatue and Coskata. Again, these red lines, and you see the shoreline moving westward, so landward. And that's true largely across much of the Barrier Beach. 1860 shoreline, and then the 2009 seaward shoreline here. Gives you a distance of 230 meters of change. The Haulover Inlet, one of the most narrow spaces here. Obviously, it was used as a haulover, short portage there. And then you can see that there have been breaches historically here in the past. And and then they've come together again. So this would seem natural, and it is, right? Here's the map, 1901, showing inlet opened here, when it happened. So these sort of rare storm, episodic nor'easter storm events are usually the culprits for these breaches. It's not the sort of everyday storm, although those will affect those sort of landward retreats. And in general, sea level rise will only add the volume of water, and the more energetic storms will only increase the likelihood of breaches and landward retreat of the shoreline. Here you can see vestiges of the old inlet channel. And that the inlets migrated northward. Then we move up towards the Great Point Lighthouse. Same trend, you see the shorelines moving landward over time. And so you can imagine that the lighthouse, which is here now, which used to be further out, will again someday be vulnerable to erosion and falling into the ocean. So we do have to think about what is the future of Great Point Lighthouse and what can we do to protect it? Or do we have to relocate it, or what will we do? And then you can imagine that if there are breaches, what will that do for our access, public access out to these places? And what will it mean in terms of storm protection, ultimately to the harbor in Nantucket? So you can see here about 750 feet of change, shoreline retreat. So it's basically moving westward. And so we're looking at potential strategies to at least continue and support public access along the entire 5 miles. And here's where there are some possible future breaches. And this is something that we work with Boston University to think about where they might occur. And these aren't exclusive of other possibilities, but those are some that jump out as some of the most potential future breaches. So what will happen if there is a breach? And these are some of the consequences that are expected. Now, we would have to certainly put this through a coastal wave sediment study and modeling effort, which we would like to do ultimately to understand what these consequences will look like in the future with varying modeling scenarios. But in general, you can see that we're looking at diminished flow through the jettied channel out further back here. Decreased tidal scour and increased channel shoaling is what is expected at the head of the harbor if a breaching occurs. Here's the increased channel shoaling and more frequent dredging is what Boston University has predicted could potentially happen if there are breaches. Not to mention the loss of public access and the sustainability and the resiliency of Coskata-Coatue for the long term. So one of the things that we've been asked to think about really here, as well as Nantucket, is, all right, so erosion along these shorelines, what will we do? What are the possibilities in terms of breaches? And we have to expect that Great Point will become an occasional island, potentially semi-permanent inlet at the head of the harbor, increased shoaling. And so, I think for all of us, there's a question of, okay, we'd like to know with more accuracy what will happen. But I think in general for us, we're already seeing public access diminish with more closures and the resiliency of that area up there at risk. So I'm going to sort of transition us now to approaches in terms of interventions and how we're thinking about this as an issue on our properties. And what we did is we actually, as part of a CZM grant-funded project, looked at stakeholder perspectives on barrier beaches, coastal banks, publicly accessible shorelines. We created an array of communication products focused largely on our Martha's Vineyard properties, as well as up in Crane. And so I'd really ask that you go to our Trustees on the Coast microsite and check these videos and white papers, podcasts out, and think about them, because I think it'll allow you to think more deeply about how this could be applied to Nantucket. But we did try to incorporate as many local stakeholders into the process to get perspectives on climate impacts, and then what could be done. Where were people's preferences? What were their impressions? So you can check all that out. We have a white paper, particularly on barrier beaches, and I think many of the vineyard beaches would be applicable in terms of thinking about models also for Nantucket. So I'm just going to go through some of the adaptation options that we actually discussed. And one of the adaptation options was that some of the dunes are completely eroded from overwash. And so the question is, could we actually create new dunes where you only have one dune? In this case, you can see in this picture, it's stretched out a little bit, but basically, you know, there's coast on either side and there's no secondary dune. There's just one long, narrow dune. Could we create some restored dune systems in these areas? It buys time, it creates more habitat, more resiliency, and it also helps to provide a source for dredged sediment that could serve a purpose in terms of habitat and public access. And so that is something we are considering at Norton Point Beach on the Vineyard and Chappaquiddick, where we've had some loss of complete primary dunes, and it's now preventing the access for thousands of people today, potentially, if we don't intervene. Now, some will say, well, you know, why intervene at all? Because, I mean, you know, the long-term trend is that you're going to lose it. But I think it's like, you know, the long-term trend for any type of maintenance is that things will go away if you don't maintain them. So I think it's really a question about, is it worth maintaining for the future, or do you just not intervene? And for us, I think if we don't intervene, the question remains open. Well, what would have happened had we intervened? And I think for many of us, in terms of climate response, this is a time of trials and innovation and learning, because then from that we'll answer the questions of, was it worth it, and how did it work, and could we make it actually buy time for the next generation? And I think anything you can do that buys time and more benefits, you know, may be worth it in the end, even if it isn't permanent for 100 years. If it provides another 20 years of benefits, maybe that's worth it. So that's kind of the mindset that, you know, you may have to get into, all of us may have to get into, as we think about adaptations. Beach grass program, very, very interesting. To once you create the dune, you want to, you know, hold that sand in place, and beach grass can be an important part of that. And it's a great effort for people locally and volunteers and youth to get involved in. And while it won't work everywhere, I mean, some of our shorebirds, they love it when there is no beach grass, right? They love the overwash areas. So in some ways, there's some short-term benefits for shorebird nesting areas because they have these sort of non-vegetated areas. But in the long run, if you want to really capture sand and hold it, you need to think about beach grass. Next adaptation option is beach and dune nourishment, or sometimes they call it dune enhancement. So you're not restoring an entire dune or not even restoring an entire shoreline, but you're adding a supplement of sand to it. And oftentimes this might be looked at as sacrificial, but it provides increased protection to the dunes behind it. Now, it has been tried and it has some applicability in certain cases. And I think for us, it's a question of how do we use this in a trial basis that we can learn from and use it as part of a research project, as well as an applied aspect of creating more resiliency, right? So, you know, I would say that we could do it in certain areas where it makes sense. And I think for us, that's really the next step, is to explore where would we actually consider these options, such as beach nourishment. Now, the thing with beach nourishment, as many of you know, is you have to find the sand, and it's best to find sand that's suitable for that type of beach and has a similar grain size and is likely to, you know, stay on the site and be of a natural source. Great if you can get it nearby on the island. And so where would we get it on Nantucket? Same questions we have in the Vineyard. There are dredging sources on the Vineyard as well, but, you know, you have to think about where all the competing projects that are looking for sand as well, and how will we find out where our projects sit within the larger set of projects happening across Nantucket. So there is going to be a question about sand supply and demand whether it's worth it or not, and when do we use it, when do we not use it. So these are the things we want to start to explore, and more practical options that we can start talking about and discussing with the community and our partners. Sand fencing is something that has been used in the past, and it's helpful to just capture sand that's already out there. It's blowing around and hold it in place, capture it, and help these dunes build up and augment as opposed to lose sand. But those are controversial as well, particularly if, like we have on our properties, shorebird management and conservation, very difficult with nesting shorebirds to use sand fencing, as it can be an obstruction to the fledglings. And natural heritage endangered species we need to work with them in terms of what snow fencing options are possible. We've looked at a variety of things at our Norton Point beach site on the vineyard that I mentioned. One is just relocation of our OSV trails, our oversand vehicle trails, and that's likely going to be the case as well in Nantucket. When do we actually change the location of those trails and shift them? And in some cases, you don't have many options to shift them, right? Because you'd be going right up into a primary dune that you need for your resiliency. So these are questions, and we're exploring all these adaptation options on the vineyard and looking likewise to do so at Coskata-Coatue as well. It's likely there's going to be a combination of efforts that we'll need to think about. One of the things that we're thinking about, of course, with all of these is cost. And I'm sure that many of you are wondering, like, yeah, how much would these projects cost? It's $25 to $40 a cubic yard for sand, and many of these projects would require tens of thousands of cubic yards. So it quickly gets up into the hundreds of thousands and even millions of dollars to do these types of projects, which is why we have to be really targeted about where we would do them and how would we fund them. And many of these have gone through permitting in other places in Massachusetts, but you have to go through design and permit phase, and that can take time. And then implementation, you have to source the sand from somewhere, and then you have to get the sand out there. So all of these questions would have to be laid out, and it could take a few years to do that. But I think given the urgency that I just mentioned earlier, time is now to begin to really lay this out and what it would look like, where it would happen, how much would it cost, what's the funding opportunities for this. So we're trying to create these projects and these concepts now so that we can start to lay a path forward for these interventions. And as I said, in a resiliency trial format. This is really about learning, and it's really about trying some things out and being thoughtful about where we do it. But there's more than just the actual physical beach. And, I think we talked about the research opportunities. We're working with the town of Essex on a research project. It would be great to work with the town of Nantucket on some coastal resilience research with our partners, Nantucket Conservation Foundation. I think there's a real opportunity for us to, through these efforts, do more project and community outreach so that we can, add and contribute to the dialogue on Nantucket. I also think our properties could be used as a place for coastal interpretation, so those visiting the properties can actually learn about coastal processes and climate, and we're hoping to do that on our vineyard properties. We have just launched it at our Crane Beach property in Ipswich. Using some interesting artistic elements that really excite people's curiosity and deepen their awareness of what's happening at our beaches. And then also we've really had a successful beach profiling citizen science group that gets out there monthly and monitors shoreline change at our beaches. And one could argue, well, why don't you just use LIDAR and remote sensing techniques? And sure, we could do that, but it's much better when you've got people who can really talk about it and tell you about it and speak within the community. And we've had really a lot of engagement and great volunteer efforts in that regard. And there's probably a much more ecological monitoring that we could be doing out on Coskata-Coatue as well, using volunteers in partnership with others on the island. So I'm going to just stop there. I know it was pretty short, but I also want to leave plenty of time for questions, since I'm sure there are many questions, and we can go back to the presentation if there is something in particular that you want to see. So thank you very much, and I'll open it up for question and answer.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was excellent. Does anyone have any questions? I'm sure there are some. We'll wait for you to get them in the chat. Tom, do you think we'll go back to that soap?
Oh,
I was saying, will these slides, could we make them available after this presentation?
yes, absolutely.
I did put a link in the chat to the State of the Coast report.
Okay, great.
People might be particularly, there was a question yesterday about the soil, just the sediment on Nantucket, and you had one slide that had kind of described the whole island and what was underneath us. Might be of particular interest.
Yeah, I mean, I put that surficial geology slide up to show where most of the beach sand deposits are, and it's not as ubiquitous as people might think. And so it's just trying to put that into perspective. And yeah, if you could also direct people to our Trustees on the Coast site so that they can look at the white papers and videos. I think it'd be really interesting to see if that model of communicating on Nantucket would be useful, because we just use that as a model it would be transferable to other communities. Because I find that there's a real communication gap sometimes. This is a very complex subject for people, the lay audience, to understand. And we've been really trying to translate all this information and data in a way that people can readily digest without being an expert and do something about it.
Excellent. We have actually, here's a great question that I've often thought of as walking or driving through the property. Deanne says, thank you, Tom, for such an interesting presentation. How did the trustees acquire this coastal property?
Yeah, I did know the history of it at one point in time. I know that there's several landowners who donated it in part. I want to say it's back in the 60s. Many of you may know better than I do. I did know it at one time, and my apologies for blanking on that, but I could certainly follow up later if needed. But I think that one of the reasons that I know there was a committee at the time that said we want to call it a wildlife refuge because it was such an amazing place for wildlife, and there was a real interest in protecting it for that purpose at the time.
You kind of touched on it when you were showing pictures of your family recreating out there, as well as this real challenge of allowing enough public access so that people understand what it is that the trustees is doing and why it's important. How do you balance that public access with wanting to actually protect the thing, make sure it doesn't get loved to death?
Yeah, that's the inherent tension in our mission. Our mission is public access and enjoyment, and natural and cultural resource preservation. So we have to hold those two at the same time. But I think the connection is that it's hard to preserve and sustain things if people don't care about them and love them. And you need to provide that access and those experiences so that people will have that connection and attachment. And that goes hand in hand with sustainability and preservation. So I guess we're always trying to figure out, how much access and when does that access really become a problem for the natural side. And I think there are times when, there are thresholds that sometimes you cross and you say that's too much and we have to close access. So that already happens today with our shorebirds, where if we have nesting piping plovers, we have to shut down miles of beach. And that's a real, trade-off for everybody. And then there are other times where, people have said, well, why do you allow oversand vehicles? But you could imagine if you don't have an oversand vehicle, it's quite a long hike. For many, it wouldn't even be accessible. And so we're trying to balance that, access and enjoyment with impact. And I think the same questions now will also go in terms of interventions, Mary, right? So do we intervene or just let the natural system of climate, take its toll? So that will be the next sort of frontier for all of us as organizations, is to think about what level we intervene.
Yeah, there's two questions that interestingly kind of relate to this. One is, at what point does the trustees let nature take over? And in other words, how far are the trustees willing to go to keep it open to the public? At some point, efforts to do so will put pressure on the wildlife refuge and the habitats. And then another question to the OSVs: Is there a carbon offset program through the OSV sticker program?
Yeah, those are all great questions, and there are probably no easy answers. I like, the OSV sticker program, carbon offset's really interesting. I think for us, the trustees, the first way we really dove into climate as a strategy, as an organization, is through coastal resilience. Just stewardship of our properties is going to require some decisions of either adapt and intervene. We try to use nature-based measures, or we may have to relocate, or we just allow nature to take its course, so to speak. But when we say nature, remember that the climate change is more than just nature. It's part of what we've done as a society and a global economy over time. So I'll say it again, this is the current mindset, which is that if we don't intervene, there would be the quite open question of, well, could there have been things that you could have done to intervene to sustain the benefits of access and habitat for a longer period of time? And if we didn't do anything, it'd be like, well, why didn't the trustees do something? And on the other hand, I think that if we don't do it smartly, then yeah, we may not be making good choices. So we're trying to use science. We're trying to use a framework of using trials to try things out and learn. I mean, we're all going to be learning about how do we cope with this. So I think right now we're all in a kind of a phase one, which is to say that let's go ahead and try some interventions where it makes sense, where we see that there's benefits over time, and then in some cases it's not worth it.
Right. I think that was something that was so Lisa's presentation yesterday, was when she showed the roadmap approach. This idea that the decisions that are being made today are not ones that people are necessarily going to follow for 30 years or forever. It's what's the decision for now, and can you change, and how will new information inform what decisions that you make next?
Exactly.
Timothy asked, can you further discuss the historical effects upon the harbor when the hullover breached, and what is likely if it opens again?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what we kind of want to know, is what is the connection, right, to Coskata as a barrier beach system to the harbor? That's certainly the town-wide thought. I mean, you saw from Boston University's prediction is that it's increased tidal scouring and channel sedimentation. And so it means increased dredging for the harbor. Perhaps it could be more, more storm impact too from surge, because now you've got a pass through for wave energy. So I think that's why we really need to understand ultimately what is the future modeling scenarios using coastal wave sediment studies with a group like Boston University, for example, so we can understand that further. Just from a practical standpoint with Nantucket Conservation Foundation, how we're getting people out there, there are some areas where we probably need to think about how do we continue to sustain public access and prevent breaches in some key spots. So that's just a purely practical, how do we keep public access out there? The town, I would love to hear what the town thinks about, how do we consider Coskata? Do they care about the breaches? Do they not? But I think we should all at least know what the impacts could be.
Absolutely. I know we've got a panel from the town this afternoon, so we may have to ask them that when they're on. Let's see. Are there other places in the world protected by other organizations that you watch closely as a model of approaches you could take? Yeah, I mean, when we did the State of the Coast report, we looked extensively at other models out there, and there are a lot of innovations in terms of concepts happening out there, but very few of them have actually got into the implementation phase because there's extensive permitting, a lot of funding required to make it happen. So if you look around and tell me if you've seen them, there are very few, models that have made it into the implementation phase. One that we did look at was Duxbury Beach. I mean, it was basically recreated dune system in a very robust way. I don't know that we'd go to that level on our properties, but that's a case where they brought in upland material and upland sand and material and created a very, very robust barrier beach system for a long period, a long distance. I don't know that we go to that kind of effort.
at this point, and they've spent millions of dollars to do that. So that's one extreme. And then, the other extreme could be like we're doing at Crane Beach, or we haven't done anything at Crane Beach, and we've lost 84 football fields of beach. And some will ask, well, how long are you going to let that continue for? So that's why we're working with BU and the town of Essex to figure out what's the future there. So I think I'd like to, again, say that we'd be somewhere in the middle with using on a trial basis and learning from other models to really inform what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I mean, the properties here are particularly important because they protect so much of the island. So you're not only protecting that property, but then that property is being used to protect Nantucket. As Peter weighs in, yes, the town cares because the hull over Coskata-Coatue form a vital natural barrier for Nantucket Harbor and
Right.
waterfront. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
And how many, just to put this into context, how many does the trustees manage? Are you in charge of?
Yeah, we have, I mean, barrier beach. We have 26 miles of barrier beach, but we own 76 miles total of shoreline, and then we protect another 40 miles through conservation restrictions. So in total, it's like 120 miles of shoreline. So we have a lot of salt marsh. I could have given a whole presentation on our salt marsh restoration resiliency efforts, but just looking at beaches right now, which I thought would probably be the large focus of this, about 26 miles, and 5 of which are Nantucket for us.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, this gets to how do you make these work at scale?
Yeah. Well, it certainly is. It's a lot of responsibility, and it's a lot to manage. And but it's interesting that you have so many different properties that you can try different things at different sites and see what might work somewhere else.
Yeah, that's definitely the idea. And yeah, I don't know if nobody asked the question about where we're going to get all this sand.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Question potentially for the town as well. I'm sure that there will be competing projects.
Well, does anyone have any questions before we sign off and take a little break before our next presentation at 11?
Great.
Yeah, well, Tom, thank you so much for your time this morning and for all the work that you and the trustees are doing here on Nantucket and elsewhere.
Great. Thanks so much, Mary. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah. Take care.